February 21st, 1946, the Kremlin, Moscow. Inside the ornate halls of Soviet power, an unlikely negotiation was reaching its conclusion. Ahmad Qavam, Iran's prime minister, who had held the position multiple times over the previous quarter century, sat across from Joseph Stalin, discussing the future of northern Iran and the withdrawal of Soviet troops that had occupied Iranian territory since 1941. The conversation, conducted through interpreters with Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov present, appeared to be proceeding exactly as Stalin had planned. Kavam was offering the Soviet Union exclusive rights to develop oil fields in northern Iran through a joint company that would give Moscow 51% control. In exchange, Stalin agreed to withdraw Red Army forces from Iranian territory. The master negotiator of the Kremlin, the man who had outmaneuvered Western leaders at Yalta and Potsdam, believed he had secured exactly what he wanted from a weak nation with limited options. Within 18 months, Stalin would discover he had been completely outplayed. How did an Iranian politician convince the world's most paranoid dictator to trust a promise he would never keep? The crisis that brought Kavam to Moscow had its roots in World War II's strategic necessities and geopolitical opportunism. On August 25, 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran simultaneously, despite the country's declared neutrality. The invasion served multiple Allied purposes, securing oil resources, preventing potential German influence, and most critically, establishing the Persian corridor supply route to deliver Lend-Lease materials to the Soviet Union fighting Nazi Germany. The sudden invasion forced Reza Shah Pahlavi to abdicate in favor of his 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who would prove far more amenable to Allied control. On January 29, 1942, Iran signed the tripartite treaty of alliance with Britain and the Soviet Union, formalizing the occupation that was already underway. The treaty's critical provision, Article 5, specified that all foreign military forces would withdraw from Iran no later than 6 months after the conclusion of hostilities between the Allied powers and Germany and its associates. This deadline, reaffirmed at the Tehran Conference in November 1943, when Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in the Iranian capital, explicitly recognized Iran's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Allied leaders pledged to respect these principles once the war ended. World War II in Europe concluded with Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945. Victory over Japan followed on September 2, 1945. According to the tripartite treaty, all Allied forces should have withdrawn from Iran by March 2, 1946, which was 6 months after the Japanese surrender. The United States began withdrawing its approximately 30,000 military personnel in late 1945 and completed the evacuation by January 1, 1946. British forces, numbering approximately 40,000 troops, completed their withdrawal precisely on March 2, 1946, adhering to the treaty deadline despite their significant oil interests in southern Iran through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The Soviet Union took a dramatically different approach. Not only did Soviet forces remain in northern Iran past the March 2 deadline, but Moscow actively expanded its influence during the occupation period. Soviet authorities in Iranian Azerbaijan and neighboring provinces implemented extensive ideological, cultural, and political programs designed to separate these regions from Tehran's control. Hundreds of specialists from Soviet Azerbaijan crossed the border to assist in this transformation, building on decades of grievances among Iran's Azerbaijani minority who spoke Turkish and had faced systematic discrimination from Persian-dominated governments. In November 1945, Soviet forces directly facilitated a coup in Iranian Azerbaijan. The Azerbaijan Democratic Party, led by Jafar Pishevari, a longtime communist who had spent years in the Soviet Union, seized control of the provincial government in Tabriz with active Red Army support. When Iranian government forces attempted to enter the province to restore central authority, Soviet troops physically blocked their advance, preventing Tehran from reasserting control over its own territory. The Azerbaijan People's Government declared itself autonomous, implementing land reforms, establishing workers' militias, and making Azerbaijani Turkish the official language. A similar scenario unfolded in Iranian Kurdistan. On January 22, 1946, the Kurdish Republic of Mahabad was proclaimed under the leadership of Qazi Muhammad. This separatist state, backed by Soviet military support and occupying a smaller territory than the Azerbaijan government, aligned itself with Peshawari's regime. Together, these Soviet-sponsored entities threatened to permanently detach approximately 100,000 square miles of Iranian territory, including some of the country's most fertile agricultural land and significant portions of its population. What made the situation even more alarming was Moscow's military posture. The international community watched with growing alarm as the March 2 withdrawal deadline passed, with Soviet forces not only remaining but reinforcing their positions. In the 3 weeks following March 2nd, Soviet reinforcements, including at least 200 tanks and 3,500 trucks, arrived in Tabriz and deployed toward multiple strategic directions: south toward Kazvin, threatening Tehran itself, west toward the Turkish border, and southwest toward Iraq. The deployment suggested suggested Soviet intentions went beyond simply supporting local autonomy movements and potentially aimed at permanent territorial acquisition, or, at minimum, establishment of a Soviet sphere of influence that would dominate Iranian politics indefinitely. On January 19, 1946, Iran became one of the first nations to bring a complaint before the newly established United Nations Security Council, charging the Soviet Union with interference in Iran's internal affairs and violation of the tripartite treaty. The complaint marked a critical test for the United Nations' ability to mediate disputes between great powers. Over the following months, the Security Council held multiple sessions on the Iranian question, with Soviet Ambassador Andrei Gromyko repeatedly claiming that Soviet troops were not involved in Iranian internal matters and that bilateral negotiations were resolving all issues. But diplomatic protests at the United Nations were not enough to dislodge Soviet forces from Iranian soil. Iran needed a leader willing to confront Stalin directly. Into this desperate situation stepped Ahmad Qavam on January 26, 1946, when the Iranian Majlis, the parliament, elected him prime minister by the narrowest possible margin, 52 votes to 51. The selection of Kavam was strategic rather than ideological. Deputies believed that Kavam, who owned extensive properties in Azerbaijan and came from a prominent political family with deep roots in the region, would have the best chance of negotiating with Stalin for the return of Iran's northern provinces. Kavam had served as prime minister multiple times before, during both the Qajar and Pahlavi dynasties, most recently in 1942 through 1943, and had a reputation as a skilled political operator capable of navigating complex crises. Kavam immediately adopted a two-track strategy that would prove decisive. On the international front, he ordered Iran's delegation at the United Nations to continue pressing the case before the Security Council, maintaining international pressure on Moscow. Simultaneously, he announced his intention to travel to Moscow to negotiate directly with Soviet leadership, a bold move that demonstrated both his confidence and his understanding that any solution would ultimately require Stalin's personal approval. The stakes could not have been higher. When Kavam arrived in Moscow in mid-February 1946 and met with Stalin on February 21, he was negotiating for Iran's very survival as an independent nation. The transcript of their meeting, preserved in Soviet archives, reveals the careful dance between the two leaders. Stalin opened by asking about Kavam's health and the weather, before inquiring about the Shah and when the current Majlis's term would expire. Kavam responded that he was not a diplomat and preferred to speak sincerely and openly, establishing a tone of directness that may have appealed to Stalin's preference for clear negotiations over diplomatic formalities. Stalin's initial position was uncompromising. He demanded that Iran recognize the autonomy of the Azerbaijan Democratic Party government, accept Soviet rights to maintain troops in northern Iran until order had been restored, and grant the Soviet Union an oil concession in northern Iran comparable to British holdings in Sayn-e, the south. The demands, if accepted in full, would have effectively ended Iranian sovereignty over its northern provinces and given Moscow permanent leverage over Iranian politics through both military presence and economic control. Most negotiators in Kavam's position would have either capitulated or walked away from the table. Kavam did neither. Instead, he rejected Stalin's initial demands but made a counter-proposal that would prove brilliantly strategic. Instead of a simple oil concession granted while Soviet troops remained, Kavam proposed a joint Soviet-Iranian oil company that would be established after Soviet troops withdrew completely from Iranian territory. The agreement would then be submitted to the Iranian Majlis for ratification, as required by Iranian constitutional law. This sequencing proved critical: withdrawal first, ratification later. The negotiations continued through February and into March, with Soviet Ambassador Ivan Sadchikov in Tehran. The final agreement, signed on April 4, 1946, specified that a joint petroleum company would be established with the Soviet Union, holding 51% of shares and Iran 49%, with ownership reverting to a 50-50 split after 25 years. The company would have exclusive rights to explore and exploit oil resources in Iran's northern provinces. Critically, the agreement stated that Soviet troops would withdraw from Iran within 5 to 6 weeks and that the arrangement would be submitted to the Iranian Majlis for approval after elections for a new parliament. Stalin had what he wanted on paper. Now, the question was whether he would actually follow through with the withdrawal. On March 24, 1946, Moscow radio suddenly announced that all disputes with Iran had been resolved and that Red Army forces would evacuate Iranian territory within the specified timeframe. The announcement created immediate international attention, with some observers believing Soviet withdrawal represented a victory for UN pressure and others crediting Kavam's diplomatic skill. The evacuation proceeded as promised, with the last Soviet troops leaving Iranian territory in early May 1946. The moment Soviet boots left Iranian soil, everything changed. The departure of Soviet forces fundamentally altered the balance of power in northern Iran. The Azerbaijan People's Government and Kurdish Republic of Mahabad, which had depended entirely on Soviet military backing, suddenly found themselves isolated isolated. Peshawari and his associates recognized their precarious position immediately. According to accounts that emerged from Soviet archives, they had sent desperate appeals to Stalin asking him not to abandon them, with some documents indicating they directly requested that Stalin help them achieve full independence from Iran rather than mere autonomy. Stalin's response proved coldly pragmatic. In a message to Peshawari dated May 8, 1946, Stalin explained that maintaining Soviet troops in Iran would give Britain and the United States justification to maintain forces around the world, and that as Prime Minister, Kavam had the formal right to send troops into any part of Iran, including Azerbaijan, making further armed resistance impractical and ill-advised. Through the summer and fall of 1946, Kavam maneuvered carefully to consolidate his position before moving against the separatist governments. He initially included members of the pro-Soviet Tudeh party in his cabinet, creating the impression that he might accommodate communist influence in Iranian politics. This tactical move bought him time while he prepared for the final confrontation. In the southern provinces, tribal revolts erupted, partly in protest against communist influence in the government. Kavam used these disturbances as justification for reasserting central government authority throughout Iran, ostensibly to restore order before elections could be held. By December, Kavam was ready to complete what he had started. On December 9, 1946, Iranian armed forces began moving into Azerbaijan and Kurdistan, officially to ensure security for upcoming parliamentary elections. The separatist governments, abandoned by their Soviet patron, attempted resistance but collapsed rapidly. The Azerbaijan People's Government had created a police state modeled after the Soviet NKVD and implemented reforms that, despite some popular support for land redistribution and workers' rights, had alienated much of the population through heavy taxation and political repression. When Iranian forces entered Tabriz on December 13th, Peshawari fled to Soviet Azerbaijan, where he would die in an automobile accident in 1947 under circumstances that remain disputed. The Kurdish Republic of Mahabad surrendered on December 15th. Qazi Muhammad and other Kurdish leaders were later arrested, tried, and executed in Mahabad's Chorchira Square in 1947. Kavam had now reclaimed Iran's territory, but he still had one final move to make. With Iranian sovereignty restored over its northern provinces, Kavam turned his attention to the oil agreement he had signed with the Soviet Union. Elections for the 15th Majlis proceeded through the fall of 1947. When the new parliament convened, the oil concession became the central issue. The constitutional framework worked exactly as Kavam had anticipated. On December 2, 1944, during an earlier crisis when both American and British companies had been seeking oil concessions while Iran was occupied, the Majlis had passed a law making it illegal for the government to negotiate or grant oil concessions to foreign powers without parliamentary approval, with violations punishable by 8 years in prison. This law provided the legal foundation for what would happen next. In late 1947, the Majlis voted on the Soviet-Iranian oil agreement that Kavam had negotiated. The result was overwhelming. 102 deputies voted against ratification, with only 2 voting in favor. The agreement was declared null and void. Based on the sequence of events and the constitutional obstacles Kavam must have understood when he signed the April agreement, it appears he structured the entire negotiation so that he could promise Stalin an oil concession while ensuring that the constitutional process would kill the deal. He had delivered on his part of the bargain by submitting the agreement to Parliament as promised. The Majlis, expressing genuine Iranian nationalist sentiment against foreign concessions, did exactly what the structure of the agreement suggested they would do. Moscow's response was predictable but futile. Soviet Ambassador Sachikov met with Kavam after the vote to demand that the agreement be renegotiated or that the Soviet Union be granted an oil concession on the same terms as the Anglo-Iranian oil company held in southern Iran. Kavam replied that the Majlis would never approve such terms, and that unlike in 1901, when the British concession was originally granted, Iran no longer had an absolute monarch who could impose agreements without parliamentary approval. The Soviet position had become untenable. Any attempt to use military force to compel Iranian compliance would contradict Moscow's stated position that the oil agreement had been voluntary and would trigger massive international backlash at a time when Soviet-Western relations were already deteriorating into Cold War confrontation. Stalin had been thoroughly outmaneuvered. He had withdrawn Soviet troops in exchange for an oil concession that never materialized. The separatist governments he had supported and protected were destroyed by Iranian forces. The entire Soviet investment in occupying northern Iran for 5 years had produced nothing except international condemnation and a significant Cold War defeat. Available evidence from Soviet diplomatic correspondence from this period suggests Stalin recognized the extent of the defeat. He ordered his foreign ministry to draft notes demanding implementation of the oil agreement, but these diplomatic protests accomplished nothing. By late 1947, Stalin's position in Iran had collapsed completely. The question that has fascinated historians ever since is simple. How did Kavam pull it off? Why did Kavam's strategy succeed where others might have failed? Several factors combined to make the deception possible. First, Kavam appears to have correctly assessed Stalin's priorities. The Soviet leader valued economic concessions more highly than maintaining puppet governments in Iranian border regions, an assessment that Soviet actions during the crisis would later confirm. Stalin believed that controlling Iran's northern oil reserves would provide long-term strategic and economic benefits that outweighed the costs of military occupation. This calculation was not unreasonable from Stalin's perspective, as British control of southern Iranian oil through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had proven immensely profitable and politically advantageous for decades. Second, Kavam exploited the structure of Iran's constitutional government. Unlike the absolute monarchies that had characterized earlier Iranian history, the 1906 constitutional revolution had established a parliamentary system where the Majlis held real power over certain decisions, particularly regarding foreign concessions and national resources. Kavam could make promises as prime minister while knowing that parliamentary approval was constitutionally required and politically unlikely. This institutional structure provided plausible deniability that proved impossible for Stalin to overcome once Soviet troops had withdrawn. Third, international pressure through the United Nations and American diplomatic support provided crucial leverage. The Truman administration, increasingly concerned about Soviet expansionism and formulating what would become the containment doctrine, viewed Iran as a critical test case. American diplomats, particularly Ambassador George Allen, who arrived in Tehran in June 1946, provided steady support for Iranian resistance to Soviet demands. While the United States did not offer military guarantees, American diplomatic backing and the promise of economic assistance strengthened Kavam's position against Soviet pressure. Fourth, timing proved essential. Kavam insisted that Soviet troop withdrawal occur before the Majlis voted on the oil concession. This sequencing meant that once Soviet forces had left Iranian territory, Stalin's leverage evaporated. Reoccupying Iran would require a new invasion that would be impossible to justify internationally and would contradict all of Moscow's stated positions about respecting Iranian sovereignty. Stalin found himself trapped by his own propaganda and the international system he had helped create through the United Nations. Fifth, the available evidence suggests Kavam understood that Stalin would sacrifice Peshawari and the Azerbaijan separatists if necessary to secure the oil concession. Soviet documents confirm that Stalin explicitly chose economic benefits over maintaining the puppet governments when forced to choose between them, a pattern consistent with Stalin's broader strategy of seeking to expand Soviet influence through economic leverage rather than direct territorial conquest in regions where Western powers maintained strong interests. These five factors combined to create the perfect conditions for Kavam's gambit, but the ripple effects of his victory would extend far beyond Iran's borders. The consequences of Kavam's diplomatic victory proved significant for both Iran and the emerging Cold War. For Iran, the successful expulsion of Soviet forces and restoration of sovereignty over northern provinces represented a rare moment of triumph for a weak nation against a great power. Kavam's success enhanced his reputation as a skilled diplomat, though his subsequent political career proved turbulent. He served briefly as prime minister, again in 1952 for only 4 days during the crisis surrounding Mohammad Mossadegh's nationalization of the oil industry, before riots forced his resignation. For the Soviet Union, the Iranian defeat marked one of the first major setbacks in the emerging Cold War. Stalin's failure to maintain influence in Iran contributed to the hardening of East-West divisions and the formulation of American containment policy. The Truman Doctrine, announced in March 1947 and pledging American support for nations threatened by Soviet expansion, drew directly on the lessons of the Iran crisis alongside the contemporaneous situation in Greece and Turkey. For American foreign policy, the Iran crisis validated the strategy of supporting nationalist governments against Soviet pressure through diplomatic and economic means, rather than military intervention. In 1947, Iran and the United States signed a military cooperation agreement, and American military advisors began assisting and training Iranian armed forces. This relationship would grow closer through the 1950s, eventually contributing to American involvement in the 1953 coup that overthrew Mossadegh and consolidated the Shah's power. The Iran crisis also established precedents for how weak nations could maneuver between great powers using international institutions, constitutional structures, and diplomatic skill, rather than military force. Kavam's success demonstrated that even nations with limited military and economic resources could achieve strategic objectives against far more powerful adversaries if they understood their opponent's priorities and exploited available leverage points. What remains indisputable is the outcome. Stalin, widely regarded as one of the most calculating and ruthless negotiators in modern history, agreed to withdraw Soviet military forces from territory they occupied in exchange for an oil concession that never materialized. Kavam had convinced the Soviet dictator to trust a promise that Iranian constitutional processes ensured would never be fulfilled. The master of the Kremlin, who had outmaneuvered Western leaders at wartime conferences and established Soviet dominance over Eastern Europe, had been completely outplayed by an Iranian politician who understood that the key to defeating a more powerful opponent was not confrontation, but deception, structured to make the deception appear legitimate even after it was revealed. In the end, the Iranian prime minister who outbluffed Stalin proved that in international politics, victory does not always go to the strongest, but sometimes to the most clever.